Nearly 8 months after hordes of violent and racist pro-Trump rioters stormed the Capitol, a deadly attack that left 5 dead, hundreds injured, and many more emotionally scarred, lawmakers have finally begun investigating the origins and the outcomes of that day, starting with 4 police officers who testified about everything they endured to protect Congress.
I could feel myself losing oxygen and recall thinking to myself, this is how I'm going to die.
20 people joined in screaming, boo. No, man, this is our house. President Trump invited us here. We're here to stop the steal.
The mob of terrorists were coordinating their efforts now, shouting heave, ho, as they synchronized, pushing their weight forward, crushing me further against the metal door frame.
Push it back!
One officer also condemned the way he and his colleagues have been treated by many congressional Republicans in the wake of the attack.
The indifference shown to my colleagues is disgraceful.
The hearing was held by a select House committee established mostly by Democrats after Republicans in both houses of Congress refused to support an independent commission. And GOP leadership did their best to distract from the testimony, trying to shift blame onto Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other top Democrats in the House.
On January 6th, these brave officers were put into a vulnerable and impossible position because of the leadership at the top has failed.
The only so-called Republicans on the committee are on the committee to grandstand and attack the former president because of their own personal vendettas. Those Pelosi Republicans aren't interested in the truth.
They also tried to discredit the only GOP members who weren't kicked off for comments they made surrounding the attacks, as you just heard. But Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger pushed back.
If Congress does not act responsibly, this will remain a cancer on our constitutional republic.
You know, democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that.
Or in this case, if we do. Joining me to discuss are Karoun Demirjian, a national security reporter for The Washington Post, and Arie Perliger, a security studies professor at UMass Lowell and the author of the book American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. Thank you both for being here. Karoun, let me start with you. For congressional Democrats, what is the goal of this committee? Is it to unearth new information? Is it to re-emphasize information that we already have, but that some people have misrepresented or possibly forgotten? Is it a combination of the two, something else?
I was just going to say it's all of the above. I think that for a lot of Democrats, it's important to retell the story in a serious, somber fashion. There have been so many accounts and yet so much political mud throwing at the same time in the last 6 months that their take is basically it's difficult for the American public to separate fact from fiction and to kind of cut through all the chaff. And so what you saw yesterday with those 4 police officers, I mean, most of those stories have been publicized before through various media, but it was different to see them all sitting there in their own words for 3.5 hours, giving this testimony about what they went through. That was a very powerful moment. And so that's one objective of this probe. The other one is, yes, to uncover as much new information as they can. I mean, look, we've been talking about January 6th to the context of various committees, even through an impeachment, the second impeachment of the president. But we don't know all the answers to what happened. And you, on that day, in the moments in the days leading up to January 6th, and you actually heard, Liz Cheney, I believe, yesterday said that we want a minute-by-minute account. We want to account for every minute of what happened. That's going to require interviewing people that have not yet been deposed, have not said what was going on in the inner sanctums of the Trump administration, where there's been reports, and our paper too has done reports about what was happening, but we don't have the full definitive play-by-play to know every last bit.
Let's talk about some of the big questions that remain unanswered. Arie, I'll go to you, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say, Karoun. But what are the big things that we still don't know at this point in time about what led up to the attack on the Capitol and happened during it?
So I think that what we do know, that this was really an organized effort. We're talking about multiple organizations, multiple movements that were really mobilizing their supporters. And we have numerous evidence that shows that they were really planning to engage in violence. They were basically interested in disrupting the certification of the results process. they had all intention basically to prevent basically the approval of the election results. There was no coincidence here. It was not a spontaneous escalation of a protest into some kind of a violent mob. No, we do have clear evidence that major members of these groups, including some of their more significant leaders, actually mobilized their supporters in order to engage in violent manifestations against law enforcement, as well as in trying to get into the building in order to disrupt the democratic process. So I think what it's really important to understand is how exactly these groups were able to prepare, to organize, to plan their actions without any real disruptions from law enforcement, from our intelligence agencies, how despite the fact that we had plenty of advance warnings about their intentions, about their capabilities, about their plans, still this eventually happened, and eventually resources were not in place in order to prevent the escalation of the event.
So as you run through that, one of the questions that raises for me, for example, would be, were members of law enforcement aware of these preparations? Did they choose to look the other way? If so, why did they choose to look the other way? For example, Karoun, would you add anything else to the list of big unknowns around this event?
I mean, I think that there are, just to capitalize on what you were just saying right then, I think there's questions about the level to which there's endemic problems in the way that we look at the intelligence that comes in and the way that that is assessed. I think that those are the systemic problems, considerable systemic problems that need to have a serious look going forward. I think also, though, there are the unanswered questions that Democrats would have probably liked to have answered during the second impeachment trial of former President Trump. I think there are going to be elements of just the specifics of which politicians were where, giving what orders, as well as just the various factors of society that are changing and are not being recognized well enough. Because this is both, the objectives are both to make sure it never happens again, right? And to make sure the Capitol is steeled and prepared so that it will not be vulnerable to this sort of thing again. But it's also to put down a verdict that is coming at a very political time. Former President Trump has a lot of sway still in certain factions of the GOP. This is going to be a very, very nail biter of a midterm election season in Congress. The majority of either the House or the Senate could swing depending on various factors. It's that close. And so I think the fact that this is happening now in this environment, given those political realities as well as those security realities, are kind of the dual mandates pulling at the various things that pull at these lawmakers, right? You have to straddle all of these spheres.
When it comes to knowledge about the event itself, leaving aside the political implications, which, as you note, are enormous, how likely is it that a select committee is going to be able to get answers to the sort of questions that we've been mentioning here? Obviously, they don't have the power that an independent commission would have. As I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, they don't have subpoena power. So it's going to be, isn't it going to be tough for them to unearth some of what we're talking about?
They do have subpoena power.
Forgive me, thank you.
Yes, they have been given subpoena power, but it's important that you raise that, because you have to put an asterisk by that, because the House has not had the greatest luck enforcing its subpoena power when people close to President Trump especially don't want to actually comply with the summons to come forward. That most of their cases have been stuck in the courts. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but the case that moved the furthest ahead, that ended up settling an out-of-court deal, still took over 2 years. They don't have 2 years between now and the midterm elections. So that doesn't set the greatest track record for going forward with these things. Sorry, I think my screen made
it happens. It's a reality of the way we live now. Yeah.
Right. But it's certainly something that they're going to try. And I think, again, this is getting a little technical, but yesterday there was an important sign from the Biden administration that they wouldn't block Justice Department officials from actually coming forward if they wanted to, if they were around during the Trump years. If that's something that's copied at the Pentagon, copied at other agencies, you actually could have a deluge of available witnesses. The question is, how do the people running this select committee choose to do that strategically? And then your first part of the question was about, what about select committees? Look, it's a mixed bag in terms of the history of how select committees go. They are usually more political than independent commissions, which creates, that whole what's happening outside the hearing room and how that information is being interpreted. But if you look at, the last history of the recent modern history of select committees, you have everything from the Senate Watergate Committee, which is a select committee that did a really good job changing hearts and minds in the country, to the Benghazi Committee from 2014, which ended up being a forum in which to talk about Hillary Clinton's emails before the 2016 election, which some people say also was very influential. But those are kind of like the two extremes. We don't know where this one's going to fall in the middle, but we are in a very extremely political time. So I think that is something one should consider when guessing the reception of how this is all going to go down.
And one thing that occurs to me is with an independent commission, you might have had pressure to reach some sort of, I don't know, attain closure that was acceptable to people who were Republicans and Democrats. And here, you've got one party basically running the show, and they may not feel that sense of obligation to bend over backwards, to tread carefully, to make sure their colleagues on the other side of the aisle are happy. Is that fair?
That's fair. I don't think anybody is worried about making any Republicans happy beyond Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger right now in the House Democratic caucus. But I think there's also the question of, I'm sorry to keep being the one that brings up the politics, but the reality
it's
is
important.
Well, it's the reality of what's possible, both in terms of pragmatic matters, like how far can you push your subpoena? Can you get former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in? Is it worth running after that goal? Or can you tell the story with other people who might be more amenable to show up? And then also, how can you tell it in a way that's actually going to convince the voters who need to reelect you and keep your majority so that you can keep doing things like this? And when I say like this, I mean, I know some people would say, there are people in the GOP who would say like this is a political witch hunt. The Democratic Party says like this is actually shining a light on what the truth is, right? But if you want to be able to keep going and keep demanding that accountability, you have to stay in office, especially in the House. That matters too.
Arie, let me get your take, since you're not steeped in the day-to-day politics of this the way that Karoun is. From your vantage point, what does the country need as a functioning polity where hopefully we can continue living together without political violence becoming normalized? What does the country as a whole need this exercise to accomplish? Or what would you hope it can accomplish?
First, I think that will help us to better understand the threat that comes from, extremist militant political groups in this country. For many, many years, we basically ignored violence that comes from domestic political actors, right? We were very reluctant to term these acts as acts of terrorism, right? For many years, for us, terrorism was a foreign policy problem. Nobody talked about domestic terrorism. We used other designations such as hate crimes or biased violence and so on. Finally, I think we're acknowledging that this is a substantial threat to our national security and to the stability of the democratic system. I think if I may, I think the main challenge is not the existence of these groups. So we always had extremists on the margins of the political spectrums. The KKK is with us for 150 years. We always had far-right groups. The major challenge is the fact that today these groups were able to mobilize the masses. They are enjoying support from a much larger constituency that they ever had in the past, when we had millions of people who are willing to follow and adopt and embrace their conspiracy theories, their views about the government and the way they challenge the government as a source of authority, the way they challenge the democratic process. This is a threat that we haven't faced before. Even in the high days of the KKK, for example, it never was able to gain such reach to such a wider audience, including the fact that there's other contributing factors. The increasing polarization within the political system, the delegitimization of political rivals, sometimes on both sides. You have much less mechanism that can bring us together today. And eventually you get to the point where you see what happened on January 6th. January 6th is not the culmination of a process. It's in many ways, it's the opening act of that process. And if we want to engage in different measures in order to, heal our democratic system, the democratic process, and as well as to find ways to educate the public, or at least prevent from these groups from promoting their narratives, we're facing significant challenges.
Karoun, I want to give the last word to you here. Without asking you to betray confidences, when you speak with politicians who are concerned about what happened on January 6th, do they see it as sort of a one-off, an event that won't happen again, certainly, but we need to figure out what went on? Or do they see it, as Arie said, as something that may be the beginning of a process or reflect a new normal that very easily could happen again down the road.
I mean, I think Arie is right to identify that fear. I think politicians who are concerned about, look, there's a very hard and fast line down the middle of Congress right now between people who want to pretend this is no big deal and make it go away, and people who are saying, no, we really need to scrutinize and look at this because this was terrifying. And I think people who fall into that latter category of we need to really look at this and figure out what went wrong are saying that because they think it is quite possible that it could happen again. They don't want to ignore anything so that they let it happen again when they're not, on the watch. But that is very much the concern. I think people on that day who were stuck in the Capitol didn't know if it was much worse than it was. I mean, it was bad as it was, but they thought that there could have been people that had bigger guns and a more serious, more deadly situation than it turned out to be. And I think that fear has stayed with them for a very long time and continues to this day, that this was bad, but it can always be worse. And that's a depressing place to be, but it's what's motivating a lot of this action that you see right now.
Well, and I have to say, I said I was going to give you the last word, but I have to editorialize a little bit. I find it incredibly dismaying as we talk about this. It was shocking to watch it unfold. And then 6 months down the road to have people denying that what we all saw actually occurred. It's really disheartening. It's hard to feel bullish about the future. On that note, Karoun, Demirjian, and Arie Perliger, thank you both for talking this through.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.